We thought, we just love each other so much, and we looked around at other people's marriages, and they were getting along okay, but nobody had a marriage like we just knew we were going to have, because we just had this tremendous love like nobody had ever had before. And so we read the only book that we could find at that time on marriage and the Bible. It's a book that I realize now is very shallow, gave us some basic ideas. And I came away from reading this book thinking that the Bible didn't have very much to say about being a woman or being a wife or a mother, just a few scattered verses here or there. So we got married, and the reality set in, and we realized there were some adjustments to make, and this love wasn't enough. It took more than love to make a marriage be what we wanted it to be. My husband graduated from high school or from college, and we moved to the Seattle area so that he could work at Boeing. And while we were here in Seattle, we had several other young couples that we used to run around with and do things together with. The man of one of these couples, he so mistreated his wife that my husband would often remark, "Boy, I don't see how she stands him." He was a hypochondriac, and we'd be playing a game, and he'd be thinking he had it running a temperature, and she'd have to jump up and go get the thermometer and take his temperature. When they had been out shopping or something and they'd come home, he would make her go through the house to make sure there were no boogeymans around inside the house while he waited at the door. I mean, this guy was really something else. But still, they were friends of ours, and we did things together with them. But this man one day started to use me as a shining example for his wife. We would be riding down the freeway together. She and I would be in the back visiting, and he would be in the front visiting with my husband. And one day he turned around and looked at his wife, and he said, "Why aren't you ever quiet like Patsy's quiet?" Of course, that made her and me both just want to crawl under the seat from embarrassment for him to do something like that. Then one day we had a bunch of people, or several couples, come over. My brother was stationed in Bremerton on the Enterprise, and he was going to take us on a tour. So we had 3 couples come over for country breakfast and then a tour of the Enterprise. And so here it is, 8 of us sitting around the breakfast table eating, and he began to browbeat his wife in front of everyone. And he says, "Why don't you ever fix biscuits and ham and gravy and eggs like Patsy does?" Yet the amount of money that he gave her to spend on groceries was so little that she could not afford napkins. She cut her paper towels in half whenever she felt like she had to have a napkin. So there was no way that she could serve ham to him, let alone serve it to guests. So this went on for a little while with us being embarrassed by the way he would use me as a shining example. Then one day he came over and he said, "Patsy, don't you think if a husband tells his wife she ought to eat beans 7 days a week, she ought to eat beans 7 days a week?" Well, I was smart enough to know that whatever I said, he was going to use it against her and browbeat her with it. And I was determined that he was not going to use me in that way. So I knew that the only kind of answer I could give him to stop using me to mistreat his wife was a Bible answer. So this Bible that I had thought didn't have very many verses in it about being a wife and a mother, I turned to it and started looking for some answers. And I turned to Ephesians 5, where it says that the husband is to love his wife as his own body and to nourish and cherish her. Boy, that sounded good. This is just exactly what this fella needs. But then I got down to the end of the chapter in Ephesians 5:33, where it told husbands to love their wives as their own bodies and to see to it that wives reverence their husbands. Now, that was a verse that didn't apply to him. That applied to me. And that verse really hit me. And it hit me because several years earlier, when my husband had asked my dad for my hand in marriage, my dad says, "You can marry her, but I want you to know that Patsy is the most stubborn person I have ever known." And my dad was right. If I thought my way through something and I came to a conclusion, it didn't matter if nobody in the whole school would speak to me. It didn't matter if my parents were mad at me. It didn't matter who didn't like what I thought. If I had thought it through, I would take a stand on it, and I wouldn't yield for anybody or anything. So my dad was right. I was a stubborn person. And here I came face to face with God's command to reverence my husband. Now, this husband that I was married to, by now, after several years of marriage, I had a pretty good list of complaints about him, things that he wasn't doing quite to my ideal. And so as I read this verse and began to understand the implications of subjection with it, I began to work to try to apply this in my life. And I had to really struggle. I cried many tears, prayed to God and said, "God, it's not fair. Why do I have to make all the sacrifices and he doesn't have to do anything? All he does is sit back and soak it up." But God said, do it. This wasn't like my dad or somebody at school telling me to do something. This was God telling me to do something. And so it was something that really pricked me. And I kept working at it. And I knew that I not only was going to have to practice this, but I was going to have to enjoy practicing it. I was going to have to enjoy being submissive, or it wasn't going to count. God wasn't going to recognize that. So I worked and I struggled. And as I've thought about this, trying to remember, how long did I work with just trying to understand and get my attitude where it should be in the realm of subjection? I don't know how long it took, but it took long enough for my friend who wanted to know if he told his wife to eat beans 7 days a week, if she should eat them. They moved away, so I didn't get to share any of this with her. But as I began to apply this to my marriage, all of a sudden this husband that I had this huge long list of complaints about, why, he just turned into the sweetest, nicest husband that anybody could ever want. Well, I quit crying. I got excited. Boy, this was neat. So I told my other friends, guess what I've discovered in the Bible? And it works. It really makes things better. So I shared it with them. They went home and tried it, and it worked in their marriages. And they got excited just like I did. So they came back and they said, well, Patsy, this really works, but have you ever thought about this over here in this area? No, I hadn't thought about it, so I was motivated to do some more studying. And through them asking me questions that I didn't know the answer to, I was motivated to continue to study and to search for answers. After several years, my husband decided to preach, and we moved to Spokane. And I started working on this material full-time, real hard. I had 4 2-hour-long classes, and I thought, that's all there is in the Bible about being a woman. I now know everything that the Bible has to say about being a woman. A lady from Seattle came to see us and sat down and went through my classes with me, and she says, these are real good, Patsy, but I've got a friend who says she doesn't love her husband anymore. Can a woman learn to love her husband again after she's fallen out of love with him? I said, I don't know. So I started doing some studying and opened up a whole new area of studying about love and the sexual relationship. And now the most common remark I have women tell me when they take these classes, this material is, I'm falling in love all over again. So we can learn to love our husbands again when we've fallen out of love with him. And as I was teaching this material in Spokane to the women there, my husband and I printed up about 100-page outline of notes for the women there in our congregation. The next thing I knew, I started to get long-distance phone calls from preachers who would say, we've seen a copy of your outline, and we'd like to have a copy for the women in the congregation here. Well, we didn't have a copy, and this was when my husband and I began to realize that we were going to have to put this in book form and make it be available more widely for other people. Volume 1 came out a little over 10 years ago. Volume 2, which is called, Volume 1 is called Appreciating Marriage. Volume 2 is called Learning to Love, where God's people make the best lovers. That came out about 3 years ago. And while I was working on Volume 2, I had some women that I had known through this whole 20-year period of time and who had been going through my material and coming to classes. I had some of these women that I knew were having some marriage problems and were coming from different types of marriage problems. I had them do some proofreading for me because I wanted to see the effect of this book upon people with different kinds of problems. Some of these women started to write me little notes out in the margin, and they'd say, this is not me, but I have a friend whose husband does such and such. And as I would read their notes and write notes back to them, it soon became very evident to me that these women had very bad attitudes towards men, very harsh attitudes toward marriage. And as the time went on and we finally talked and they finally admitted, yeah, this is me, it's my friend too, but it's me too. And we began to talk about some of the problems that they were having. They convinced me that the other side of marriage needed to be told. The desperate marriages, the marriages that do not respond to the normal teaching. And as I have been teaching this material, I have noticed that in about 90 to 95% of the cases, the marriages make tremendous changes and really get a lot better. But in 5 to 10% of the marriages, they don't. There's some improvement, but not what you would expect. And these are the women that were talking to me about. You need to deal with the 5 to 10% who do not respond. And generally what I discovered in those cases is there is some type of sin that the man is involved in. The woman, now she may have been involved in some sin, but she is learning her role. She is changing. She is trying to not be sinning in her relationship in the marriage. But the man is involved in some kind of habitual sin that he is not willing to deal with and to change. And then this causes problems in the woman trying to deal with this type of sin. And so the second series that we're going to be having in a series of classes called Desperate Marriages has come about because of these women 3 years ago asking me some questions and pricking my thinking, so that really I'm still growing. People are still asking me questions that I can't answer, and I'm still being stimulated and motivated, and I'm still learning. I no longer say, I know it all. This is all that God has to have in the Bible about being a woman, about being a wife, and being a mother, marriage. Because really, our Bible is, as we grow and change, the knit is able to satisfy our needs. So I want you to know that as a little bit about me, where I'm coming from on these lessons. And as we begin the Song of Solomon tonight, Song of Solomon is designed for women really of all ages. And as we get into the Song of Solomon, we're going to see that the Song of Solomon is a fascinating love triangle. And these little pictures up here that I'm going to be sharing with you on the transparencies come from a book that I have that is an artist's interpretation of the Song of Solomon. There's no words in the book. All it is artwork. So I'm going to be sharing some of that artwork with you on the transparencies. But the Song of Solomon is a fascinating love triangle. Several years ago, I took a writing class and listened to a romance writer talk about how to write a successful romance. And as I listened to her talk, I got very excited because the formula that she was giving for writing a successful romance that would sell and just make you a tremendously rich writer, this formula was exactly the same formula that the Song of Solomon followed. The Song of Solomon, if you examine it just strictly as a piece of literature, is a very skillfully and beautifully written book. It is very unique in the way that it's written. If you are going to have a successful romance, you need 3 things. You need an innocent girl, you need a good man, and then you need a bad man. But you need this girl not to know that the bad man is bad, and for her to wrestle back and forth with which one of these men should I marry or find as a boyfriend. And so you've got to have the bad guy, and you've got to have the good guy, and you've got to have a girl wrestling with who should I marry. Now, the difference between the Song of Solomon and these romances is that the Song of Solomon is about real people. It is about real people who lived. And I see some of you taking notes. After our class tonight, I'm going to be passing you out an outline that will look like what we have up here on the transparency. So that will be there for you if you want to just listen. But the Song of Solomon is about real people, people who really lived. And in the Song of Solomon, we have a Shulamite maiden. The Shulamite maiden is probably between 12 and 16 years old. And she's probably not as old as 16, because if you were 16 and not married, you were generally considered an old maid back at this time. So she's probably 12 or 13. She is a very young girl. So we have the Shulamite maiden who's out working in the vineyard when Solomon comes along. She's taking care of the vineyard for her brothers. King Solomon is a very powerful and rich king, and he is the one who is infatuated, as we're going to see, with the bodies of women. He is searching for the most perfect body to make him happy. Now, King Solomon is the most perfect man in history to test whether sensuous love or physical love is really what love is all about, because he had access to beautiful women all over the whole world. If ever a man could have found the most perfect body to make him happy, Solomon should have been able to have done this. Then we have the shepherd boyfriend. This Shulamite maiden is like girls today, that if they're attractive and have pleasant personalities, then generally speaking, when the time is right, they have a boyfriend. She has a boyfriend too. And so she is going to be struggling back and forth with who should she marry, King Solomon, or should she marry the shepherd boy. Now, I know that a lot of you, some of you that are members of this congregation, you know that Bill Spawn has taught a lesson on the Song of Solomon, and he took the position that the Song of Solomon had only one man and one woman in it, that the shepherd and Solomon were the same. Some of you from South Hill congregation know that Gary Martin has written a book. He takes the position that there's also only one man and one woman in the Song of Solomon. And that's why I've spent 4 hours going over this with Bill and discussing the differences between the two positions with him. And that's why I've handed you the handout. I don't want to take our time to do that in class because basically their positions are not the common positions, and that doesn't mean that they're wrong, but if I was taking an uncommon position, I would feel like I needed to take the time to prove to you that this is where I'm coming from. If you have a question along this line, after we have finished the Song of Solomon and you're familiar with the language and the verses, then we can either have a special class or I will meet with you privately. Whatever, we will find a way, if you have a special interest, to talk about, to get into the details about the different positions. Basically, among Christians, most people in the church take the position that there is two men, Solomon and the shepherd. If you go to the Bible bookstores and get their books on the Song of Solomon, and books on Song of Solomon are becoming more and more popular, generally they will take the position that there is one man and one woman. And as I have read several of these books, my impression of these books is that the authors are wanting to teach certain things about the sexual relationship. They are wanting to teach certain techniques, and they manipulate verses in the Song of Solomon that are not even talking about the sexual relationship to make these verses talk about certain techniques. So they are trying to force the Song of Solomon into teaching things so that Christians will have healthier attitudes towards this relationship. Now we're going to be talking about having a healthy attitude towards the sexual relationship. The Bible has a tremendous amount to say about the sexual relationship, and we do not need to manipulate the Song of Solomon in order to teach the things that need to be taught. One basic difference in the Song of Solomon, just so that sometimes the charge is made that people who believe that there is a shepherd, that they just arbitrarily assign certain verses to the shepherd. That is not true. In the Song of Solomon, the expression, my beloved, or you whom my soul loves, is used 43 times. Each time, I believe it is referring to the shepherd, and with the exception of 4 passages, every shepherd passage has the expression, my beloved, in it. In 2 of these passages, the beloved is described as the shepherd. It is asked, where is the shepherd? He is out, or where is my beloved? He is out pasturing my sheep. So instead of calling him the shepherd boyfriend, we could call him the beloved boyfriend. And we're going to be noticing the expression beloved all the way through the Song of Solomon. The expression beloved, I do not believe, is ever used to refer to King Solomon. So it's not an arbitrary choice. There is between, I like this guy's speech, so it must be the shepherd. I don't like this guy's speech, so he must be Solomon's. And if you'll take the time to read the handout that I've given you, you'll see that there is a lot of reasoning behind this. So as we continue our lesson tonight, what we're going to do is basically, we're going to have an introduction to the Song of Solomon, and then next week we will start a verse-by-verse study of the Song of Solomon. First thing we want to notice in the Song of Solomon, that it is, there are 3 emotion-packed writing techniques in the Song of Solomon. So again, I'm sharing some of my writing class things that I've learned with you, because the Song of Solomon is a fascinating piece of literature to discover. The Song of Solomon is written in a very skillful way to capture our emotions. It is a book to be felt, a book to be experienced. And as you examine the Song of Solomon, one thing that involves the emotions is that it is written in the form of a play. It is to be visualized. It is to be seen. And so if you will take the time to visualize the Song of Solomon, then you're going to get more out of it. So it was made to be acted upon, just like when we go and watch a movie and we get emotionally involved in it. The Song of Solomon is designed to capture our emotions through being written as a play. Second, when you examine the Song of Solomon, you find out that it is entirely dialogue. There is no narration at all in the Song of Solomon. If you want to make your writing more powerful, more full of emotion, then you sprinkle dialogue all the way through it, because dialogue is a very powerful form of writing. In the Song of Solomon, it is solid dialogue. You want to know what happens, then you tell what happens through the dialogue. For example, towards the end of the book, when the Shulamite finally realizes that Solomon is only after her body, he does not care about her as a person, and she is sick of him, she doesn't want to have any more to do with him, she sees the shepherd come in the back door. Now, instead of saying the shepherd walked in the back door, it says, the Shulamite said, "Behold, my beloved." And you can feel her emotion, her excitement that he's there, and you know he's there. The country people say, "Who is this coming up from the wilderness, leaning on the arm of her beloved?" So you know the Shulamite and the shepherd are traveling from the palace back to their country home. So everything you know about the Song of Solomon, it comes from dialogue. And so this is a powerful way of writing, a powerful way to capture our emotions. Thirdly, if you want to put emotion into your writing, then you write it in the form of a poem. Now, poetry is not my favorite type of writing, but it is still a very emotional type of writing. And so the Song of Solomon is written, has these three techniques that are designed to capture our emotions, have had these three techniques used into it so that it will capture our emotions and it will appeal to us. This is very important for several reasons. During courting love, when young boys and young girls are dating, their emotions many times get in the way. They act upon their emotions instead of their reasoning. So it takes something to appeal to our emotions a lot of times to capture our intellect and to make us think about something in a different way. Just the other day I got a writing magazine and it had an article in here on how to write for teens. And it has a little excerpt in here that I think that applies to what we're talking about. This lady says that someone told her that there are 3 words to describe a teenager. They are emotions, emotions, emotions. And those emotions can change so fast, it must be all those hormones going wild. So here it is, a teenager has all these emotions affecting them. If you want to be a successful writer for teens, then you appeal to their emotions. And this is exactly what God has done in the Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon is written for teenagers. Now, those of us who are older, we love it because we still have emotions. We're more emotional than the men, and we get a lot out of it, but it was designed basically to appeal to teenagers. So the Song of Solomon has these 3 very effective writing techniques. Then I have down here that it was written by a woman. And this is something that's strictly my opinion, and we can come back and talk about this towards the end of the Song of Solomon after you've had a chance to examine the verses and to know more about it. I came to this conclusion after about 17 years of teaching the Song of Solomon. And what made me come to this conclusion is one time I was teaching the Song of Solomon for some ladies, and at the same time my husband was preaching some sermons on judging motives. And as I would listen to him preach these sermons on judging motives, how no one knows the thought of a man unless that man tells him those thoughts, it began to dawn on me that the Song of Solomon is filled with the Shulamite's thoughts. You do not have any of Solomon's thoughts. All you have are his words, but over and over again you have the Shulamite's thoughts. So how do we know the Shulamite's thoughts unless she tells us her thoughts? Well, God could have inspired a man to have written the Song of Solomon, but if a man wrote the Song of Solomon, he wrote it as if he were the Shulamite. So if a man wrote it, he wrote it as if he were a woman. And my understanding of history back at this time, that men had a healthy attitude towards women, and they would have not been offended to have done that, so a man could have written it. But as we get to the end of the story, we're going to see that the Shulamite became kind of a folk hero. And the people in the country were wanting to know about, here, you've been to the palace. Solomon has examined you. Solomon was going to have you for his wife, and you turned him down. You married the shepherd. What happened? And she told her story to the folk people. And so I think this is the record that we have that God has preserved for us, that it was written by a woman because of her emotions, or not her emotions, but her thoughts. And as we talk about looking into the Shulamite's mind and thinking about her, this verse in 1 Corinthians 2:11 is where it says, "Who knows the thoughts of a man unless that man tell us?" Back to this article that I had on how to write for a teenager, has something else about teenagers that is relevant to this point. It says, adolescence is also a time when a person's inner voice is louder than the outer voice. Let your reader hear them both. We call it going into their heads. The outside world sees Sarah strolling through the halls of high school, waving cheerfully to friends and taking her seat in class as usual. Meanwhile, the monster critic inside Sarah's head is saying, "You shouldn't have worn that dress. Everybody's staring at you. And why did you say that? That was a stupid thing to say." Or, "My, you're sitting in the front desk. Everybody behind you will see your dandruff." And so this writer is saying that part of being a teenager is continual thinking through things, continual self-examination. And as we go to the Song of Solomon, if this is a true picture of a teenager, then the Song of Solomon is a true representative of a teenager. Because the Shulamite, we are continually going to her thoughts. Her thoughts are given to us just over and over. Solomon will say something, and it doesn't tell us what she said. It tells us what she thought. So this is something that makes me appreciate even more how much God really does love teenagers. This book is designed for them, for the way they are and the problems that they are facing in life. And as I said earlier, it's written to women, a very special book. You know, men love the Song of Solomon and get a lot out of it, but they don't get as much out of it as women do. There have been several times when I've sat in on classes where my husband has taught the Song of Solomon. And I remember one time in Amarillo, I had taught the Song of Solomon to the ladies there, and a little while later, he preached a series of sermons on the Song of Solomon. And there was one point in there where I just thought he completely missed the point. And one of the ladies came up to me, and she had picked up on that too. And she said, "Why did he teach it that way?" And I said, "Because he's a man. He's never had that feeling before. I've had it, you've had it, so it makes sense to us, but he has never had that feeling before, and the only thing he knows about that feeling is what some woman has told him." So it's a book that is dealing with a woman's feelings, with a woman's emotions, and is very special to women. But men can benefit too. It tells men how to choose a wife. You've got King Solomon, who at this time, I believe, had 143 wives. Before he died, he had 1,000 wives. He was a man who was trying to find the perfect wife, and he never succeeded. And so this book is going to teach us, a young man, how to choose a wife, like the shepherd who won over King Solomon. So they can learn how to choose a wife, and then they can also learn how to understand a wife. They can learn a little bit more about a woman's emotions and the way she thinks and the way she feels, which in 1 Peter 3:7, men are commanded to live with their wives according to understanding. And you know, really, men talk about how complicated we are and how hard it is to understand a woman, but really, our needs are very simple. That if our husbands will just understand how much we crave love and affection and attention, then that's all there is to know, to how to make us happy, basically, and to be treated with consideration. And so we're really very simple creatures, but men tend to make it hard. And the Song of Solomon is going to help them know a little bit better how to live with a wife. Now, as we think about the Song of Solomon a little bit more, we find that the Song of Solomon is a guide for teenagers. It is a guide for them as they go through the transition from parental love to romantic love. Every mother in here, I see lots of mothers in here with their teenagers, and every mother in here has got her favorite stories to tell about her daughter as she was a toddler and little preschooler. You know, they just do the sweetest things and just say the neatest things. They're so cute, they're so innocent, and little toddlers are just really wonderful. They're always up in your lap, and they're wanting hugs and kisses, and this is a very special time. But you know, those little toddlers grow up, and they reach an age where mother and dad's hugs and kisses are no longer satisfying. There's no longer going to do what they need. They need something more. They're looking towards romantic love because this is what God, He's made them this way, and it's time for them to grow up. And so the Song of Solomon is to help teenagers make this transition from parental love to let go of parents and to reach out to romantic love so that they can be successful in this realm. But while we're making this transition, we need to recognize some things that are happening to the teenager on the way. Have down here, they're making the transition not only from parental love to romantic love, they're making the transition from child to adult. And I've got down here what happened to that sweet little toddler and preschooler. When my daughter Amanda was a little toddler and preschooler, I always had women coming up to me. Some of them were relatives. And they'd say, "Oh, aren't toddlers sweet? But someday they're going to turn into teenagers." And I don't know how many times I've had that said to me. My daughter used to come home from school last year, and she'd say, I've got this friend at school, and his mother is always telling him, you used to be such a nice kid. You were such the sweetest little toddler. Whatever happened to you? After I had the announcements printed of what the classes were going to be about, and I had this up there, an older lady came up to me and she says, you know, my mother used to say that to me all the time. You used to be such a sweet little kid, but what happened to you? What happened to you along the way? So we're going to talk a little bit about what happens along the way as they make the transition from being a child to an adult. First thing we need to realize is that as they are a toddler and pre-adolescence, their body is developing. They're learning how to walk. They're learning how to talk. They're growing taller. They're growing stronger. And their parents are their role model. You know, your daughter's in there in the kitchen. Whatever you do, she wants to do it too. Can I help, Mother? And then it seems like they get a little bit older where you just nearly have to beat them to make them come in and help you do something. But as they're little toddlers, the mothers and dads are their role model. I want to grow up and be just like Mommy. I want to marry a man just like Daddy. And this is a fun and exciting time as our children are developing. But as they continue to develop and then they enter adolescence, what we find is as they start to become a teenager, that their brain unfolds 1/3 of its full volume or amount in just a matter of a few months. They are changing very rapidly mentally, and it is a time for them to re-examine everything intellectually. And we as parents need to recognize this in our children, that even though we taught them as toddlers that this is the thing to do, you don't lie, you don't do this, and you do this over here, as we taught them all these things and they listened to us and they responded, when they enter adolescence, we have to do it all over again. And we have to do it on a higher plane. They're no longer willing to accept it because Mom and Dad say it. They're only going to accept it if we can prove it to them, if we can show them the logic behind it, because they are developing intellectually and they are wanting to see things for themselves. So we really have two important times of teaching our children. Once as toddlers, and then we've got to turn around and do it all over again because their brain is developing. And so it's a time to re-examine things intellectually. Then this is also a time when their goals are developing. It's a time when they are remembering and they are planning the future. And as their goals are developing, David Wilkerson has several books out on teenagers, and he travels across the country speaking to teenagers. And he says that everywhere he goes, he finds that teenagers are very bitter. That they are very bitter about all the things that have ever happened to them all through their life. And the reason this happens is because during this time, teenagers are going through a period of remembrance. They are setting goals for their future, so they are remembering everything Mom and Dad did. Supposedly, they're supposed to be remembering the good along with the bad, but a lot of times this gets thwarted and they're remembering just the bad things as they're setting their goals. I don't want to grow up and do this like Mother, or I don't want to do that like Dad, or I do want to do this like my parents, or I want to do this over here. And during this period of time, when this bitterness develops, I have a theory about why I think all of this tends to happen. When you go back and you study how hormones work in a person's body, you find that during a woman's when she's pregnant, you find that during sexual orgasm, and when teenagers are going into adolescence, that you've got tremendous hormones affecting your emotions. And scientists have done a lot of experimenting with hormones. They have taken the hormones that are found in pregnancy, and they have injected them into roosters. And I tend to say male roosters, so we'll all know that roosters are the male. They're not the mother hens. So these roosters, when they inject this hormone, this pregnancy hormone into roosters, all the roosters suddenly become very motherly. They go around the barnyard and they gather up all the little chicks under their wings and just really do a good job of taking care of all these little chicks. And it's because of this hormone is making them be motherly. Back when Amanda was a little toddler, we had a lot of young women in our congregation who were having babies off and on. And so I could always tell who was pregnant before they were showing and before they were telling anybody, because of the way they acted toward my daughter and the way my daughter responded to them. My daughter, when she was a little toddler, just loved pregnant women. These pregnant women were just like these roosters. All the little kids, they just gather them up and, oh, isn't this the cutest little kid? And whatever that little kid wanted to say, they were just hanging on every word. And the little toddlers just loved them. So anytime I saw Amanda showing this love for some woman, I'd go tell my husband, well, so-and-so's pregnant. Well, how do you know that? Well, because Amanda loves her. So these hormones are hormones that tremendously affect a person. When a woman knows how to enjoy the love relationship with her husband, she has hormones that make her more loving towards her husband. So God has given us hormones to help us do our job, to bring about the right responses to us. Now, pregnant women also have another hormone. And this is a hormone that causes them to remember. During the time that they are pregnant, they begin to remember all the things their mother used to do in raising them, the good things and the bad things. And as they're thinking about their children and are going to be having a baby, and this is helping them prepare to be a mother, to think through, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that or not do that. You know, when both of our children are adopted, and when we adopted Amanda, we found out about her 3 days before she was born. We got her when she was 10 days old. So we had 13 days to prepare for parenthood. My husband and I went around with splitting headaches that could not be relieved by anything. And we said, boy, God knew what He was doing when He gave you 9 months to prepare for a baby. And so if you've got to go out and buy baby clothes and baby furniture and think about what do I do with the baby once I've got it in 13 days, there's just not enough time. So God has made women so that when they're pregnant, they're going to be thinking about these things. They're going to be preparing mentally for it. I suspect that this is what happens to teenagers, that God, during this time when their hormones are affecting them, that He is causing them to remember, because it is time to set life goals. It is time to plan for their future, to think about, do I want to grow up and be like Mom, or do I want to marry a man like Dad? And it's time to make these decisions. But sometimes, instead of remembering the good along with the bad, teenagers just focus in on everything their parents ever did wrong, and they get very bitter towards their parents. This is not God's plan. It's not a time to be a bitter. Every child, children, I ask my daughter all the time, do you remember such and such? And she says, no. Oh, that's the neatest memory I have, and she can't remember it. And so there's neat things that have happened with every teenager when they were little, but they're focusing in on the bad things. And I think that one thing that parents can do to help their children is to get out the scrapbook. Or you see a cute little toddler will say, oh, that reminds me of when you were little and you did that. Help them remember the good things. Help them have a balanced view and realize that this time for remembering is not just for the bad times, but it's also for the good times too. Bitterness is something that when we were in Spokane, I had an occasion to be around a woman who was very bitter. And ever since that time, it has made me realize how really horrible bitterness is, and that we need to do everything we can to keep from allowing bitterness to come into our heart. This lady was an older woman whose husband had been an alcoholic. She had had a son who had a real high temperature when he was real young, and she did not know the danger at that time of having a real high temperature. And so his brain had fried, and he was mentally damaged from this high temperature. He later committed suicide. So this lady had a lot of bad things in her life, and she was extremely bitter. And because of her bitterness, and we were a congregation of a lot of young people, and we just thought, we can just love this lady so much that she'll come out of this bitterness, and that we'll overcome her bitterness by just loving her so much. But the more we loved that lady, it didn't really have that much effect on her, and she began to cause problems in the congregation with other people. And so it reached a point of time where she was being disciplined by the congregation. At that time, I was calling the lady several times a week to visit with her, and once she started to be disciplined by the congregation, I quit calling her because I felt like that would be encouraging her in her wrong rather than helping her straighten up. So this lady, instead of coming to me and asking me why I wasn't calling her, and I would have told her why, she went to another lady and she said, Patsy doesn't call me anymore. Well, this lady thought she would do me a favor and make excuses for me instead of telling the lady, you need to go talk to Patsy and find out why she's not calling you. So she tried to do me a favor and made excuses, and she said, well, you know, Patsy's awful busy. She's doing this and she's doing that. And so she just told her I was too busy to call her. A few weeks later, I got a very ugly letter from this lady, and she was just raking me over the coals, and she says, I asked you why you didn't call me, and you told me you were too busy. I thought, boy, I know I didn't tell her that. I would have told her the truth if she had asked me. A little while later, the lady who had told her that happened to mention in a conversation, so-and-so called me and was complaining about you not calling her, and I told them you were too busy, or told her you were too busy. So here this lady, in her bitterness, had taken something that someone else told her and had built a case around thinking that I had told her that when I hadn't told her that. And I have observed through the years that bitter people lose touch with reality. They do not know what's going on around them. They lose the ability to think clearly. They don't know who says what and who did what. It is all meshes together in their mind in an extremely bitter way. So bitterness is something that we need to be very careful for, because bitterness is a very damaging thing. Whether we're a teenager or whether we're an older person, if we let bitterness come into our heart. In Hebrews 12, verses 15 through 16, where it's talking about Esau and his bitterness, and how that if we do not take care of bitterness, that bitterness springs up. Bitterness always gets worse. It grows, and by it many are defiled. This word defiled here means it means to dip or to dye. It's like taking a piece of cloth and sticking it down into some dye, dipping it into dye so that its color is completely changed. So God says when we allow bitterness to come into our heart, we are defiled. We are made different. We are no longer the same person, and so we lose our touch with reality. And so we need to fear bitterness. Then teenagers need to realize that as they're going through this period of remembering, that parenting is a matter of judgment. In Hebrews 12, verse 10, God says, we had earthly fathers who disciplined us as seemed good to them. God gives parents the right to make judgment calls on discipline. And because discipline is largely a matter of judgment, parents make mistakes. There is not a single parent in here, if we asked for a show of hands, if we said, if you had it to do all over again, would you do something different? Everybody in here would do something different, because hindsight is better than foresight. And as we, as parents, as we think about our going through this period of remembering, every one of us, if we ask for a show of hands, how many of you made a pledge to yourself when you were growing up that you were going to discipline or you were going to love different than your parents? Nearly every person in here would raise their hands if they had made this decision. They were something that they were going to do different. Now, teenagers, as they're going through this time of remembrance, they're going to see things their parents did that they didn't like, and they're going to say, I'm going to do different. And you may succeed and do different. But do you know someday when you have a teenager and they're going through this time of remembering, they're going to be critical of you and the way you're doing things different, and they're going to determine to do things differently too in different areas. And I'm not saying just necessarily throw out everything, talking about more individual things of discipline. They're going to be looking at them and doing different. So as during this time of the transition from child to adult, their body is still developing, but it is slowing down in comparison to how their brain is developing. It's a time for setting goals and for remembering how it is that God, or what it is we want to do with the rest of our lives. It is also a time when their personal integrity is developing. And by personal integrity, I mean being honest with themselves. I'm going to do this and I'm going to believe it because I can see it, not because mom and dad said this is the way I should think or this is the way I should feel. Teenagers are very idealistic. They have a very idealistic view of the world. And so when adults, whether it's their parents or someone else, does something that disappoints them, something that is bad, it is something many times that is very hard for a teenager to deal with because they are very idealistic. And they believe the best, they want the best as they go through the world. Now, as this personal integrity is developing, In Ephesians 4:13 through 15, this is a passage of Scripture that you're all familiar with. It's talking about don't be as a child, being tossed to and fro. This is part of being a child, being tossed to and fro. And you know, many times when if you have a teenage daughter or a teenage son, I'm sure it's the same with sons, they'll come in and they'll tell you something, and you'll think, boy, that's the most outlandish thing I've ever heard in my life. And you just want to jump right all over that teenager and convince them to change their mind. And no, you don't really think that way. You don't really feel that way. But if you'll just be quiet and patient, a couple of days later they'll come and they'll tell you just exactly the opposite. And the reason this is because the teenage years is a time of firsts. It's first car, it's first job, it's first kiss, it's first date, it's first heartbreak. They don't have any past experience to judge a lot of these things on. And so they're looking at the world fresh. They're having to discover a lot of things for themselves. And it's a time of being tossed to and fro. As we go through the Song of Solomon, we're going to see that the Shulamite is tossed to and fro. Who should I marry? Struggling back and forth. And it's obvious to us as we go through the story, but it's not obvious to her. She was a real person. She was right there in the middle of it. She was caught up emotionally. This is part of the thinking process. Anytime we're thinking through something, we're going to examine one argument and think it's this way, and then we'll examine another argument and think it's no, that way. As our teenagers are being tossed to and fro, then all it does, it simply shows that they are thinking through this period of time.